Alabama used a new method of execution this month, and the first man to be put to death by nitrogen hypoxia was Kenneth Eugene Smith. Born on July 4, 1965, Smith was found guilty of killing Elizabeth Sennet in Colbert County, Alabama, on March 18, 1988. Elizabeth's husband, Charles Sennet Sr., enlisted Billy Gray Williams to kill his wife. Smith and John Forrest Parker were hired by Williams to help carry out the murder. Elizabeth Sennet was fatally stabbed by Smith and Parker at her Colbert County home. Charles Sennet Sr. took his own life a week after Elizabeth Sennet was killed after finding out he was a suspect in the crime. Billy Gray Williams passed away in jail in November 2020 after receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Both Smith and John Forrest Parker received death sentences. In June 2010, Parker was put to death by lethal injection. Smith was still awaiting execution. Smith was supposed to be put to death by lethal injection in November 2022, but the execution was called off because Smith's intravenous lines could not be connected in time for the Alabama Supreme Court's death warrant to still be valid. Smith and the state reached a settlement in which the state agreed to use nitrogen hypoxia, a secondary technique of execution, rather than the primary method of execution, lethal injection, which is the default method used in Alabama. Billy Gray Williams, a tenant of Pastor Charles Sennet Sr., was recruited by the pastor to kill his wife, Elizabeth Dorleen Sennet, 45 years old. Williams enlisted the help of Kenneth Smith and John Forrest Parker to execute the scheme. Charles intended to reimburse the men $1,000 each for the killing. Elizabeth Sennet was discovered deceased in her home on March 18, 1988. One of the first individuals on the scene, Sheriff Ronnie May, was unable to identify Elizabeth's pulse, but upon the arrival of emergency medical technicians, they were able to locate one. May said that when Charles learned that Elizabeth did have a pulse, he almost fainted. After that, May traveled in the ambulance with Elizabeth, and hospital staff pronounced her dead. Investigators believed the house was set up to give the impression of a home invasion. May recalled having met Charles a few weeks before the incident, at which time they were looking into another murder and had to repeatedly urge Sennet to leave the scene. The names of the suspects were provided to the investigators over the phone. Charles was questioned by investigators on March 25, but denied any participation. He blushed when someone asked him if he knew Kenneth Smith as he was leaving. After the interview, Charles went to his church and met with his sons and their families. There, he confessed to killing their mother and having an affair. After that, Charles proceeded to the parking lot, got into his truck, and shot himself. To minimize pre-trial publicity, Smith's trial was moved from Colbert County to Jefferson County, where he was found guilty. By a vote of 10-2, the jury in Smith's first trial found him guilty of killing Elizabeth Dorleen Sennet and advised the trial judge to have him put to death. If less than 10 jurors vote in favor of the death penalty, the inmate will get a life sentence. Though the jury's recommendation is not legally binding, the judge does consider it carefully before determining the appropriate sentence. Smith received the death sentence, but an appeal overturned both the conviction and the punishment. The jury in Smith's second trial recommended a life sentence. However, the judge disregarded their advice and gave Smith the death penalty. In 2022, Smith used up all of his remaining appeals related to the second conviction and imprisonment. On November 17, 2022, Smith was supposed to be put to death by lethal injection. A representative of the Alabama Department of Corrections wrote Smith's attorneys at 7:45 p.m., informing them that Smith was being prepared for execution, even though he had a motion to postpone his execution pending before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Smith had a phone conversation with his wife, and at 7:57 p.m., his call was ended by the prison staff. After being shackled and handcuffed, Smith was led to the death chamber. The 11th Circuit issued a stay of execution shortly afterwards, and Smith's attorneys promptly gave it to the Alabama Department of Corrections. In response, the Department of Corrections stated that they were aware of the stay, but they still kept Smith strapped to a gurney in the execution chamber without telling him or allowing him to consult with his attorneys. The execution team arrived at 10 p.m. and made an attempt to insert an IV into Smith's arm. Around 10:20 p.m., the 11th Circuit stay of execution was lifted by the U.S. Supreme Court. When Smith claimed to be having the needle inserted into his muscle, one of the execution team members corrected him. After placing Smith in an inverted crucifixion position, the crew left the room and came back a short while later to inject him with an unidentified medicine in spite of Smith's protests. Another started poking Smith's collarbone many times with a needle in an attempt to establish a central IV line. Smith's execution had to be put off at around 11:20 p.m. due to the unsatisfactory results. Smith was sweating profusely and breathing heavily, and he was unable to use his arms or walk on his own. This was the state of Alabama's third botched execution in a row. Governor K.I.V. of Alabama ordered an examination of the state's execution procedure after the event. In order to give Department of Corrections employees more time to carry out executions, Governor Ivey also requested that the Alabama Supreme Court modify the state court regulations dictating death warrants. On January 12, 2023, the Alabama Supreme Court gave its approval to the amendment. A second death warrant was issued, directing Smith to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia on January 25, 2024. Nitrogen hypoxia was an alternate method of execution that had never been used in Alabama or in any other state in the world. On January 10, 2024, a federal judge decided that Alabama could carry out Smith's nitrogen gas execution. Sennet's family, including her 2 kids, backed Smith's execution on January 24, 2024, after the Supreme Court declined to consider his appeal and turned down his plea for a stay of execution. However, human rights organizations and the United Nations expressed fear that the method of nitrogen gas execution, which has never been used before, could result in cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or even torture. Previously, Smith's attorneys contended in the rejected Supreme Court appeal that carrying out a second attempt at execution for Smith following his initial survival was illegal. Smith's last attempt to halt his execution was denied by the Supreme Court on January 25, and that same evening at 6 p.m., his death sentence was set to be carried out. One of the victim's 2 sons, Chuck Sennet, responded by saying that Smith should suffer repercussions for killing his mother, feeling that she was forgotten because of the nitrogen hypoxia manner of execution that was making headlines instead of the woman's murder. The governor of Alabama, K.I.V., had previously refused to pardon Smith, which would have permitted Smith's death sentence to be commuted, if successful, to life in prison. 8 hours before he was executed, Smith had his last dinner, which consisted of steak, hash browns, and eggs. His wife and boys also paid him a final visit. Smith accepted his impending death and was at peace despite his fear of the consequences of being executed by nitrogen hypoxia, according to Reverend Jeff Hood, Smith's spiritual advisor, who spoke to the Associated Press. His last words were, "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. Thank you for supporting me. Love all of you." Smith was given nitrogen gas for 15 minutes, and after 25 minutes, he was declared dead. It seemed that Smith's death happened 10 to 15 minutes after the gas was given, since his movement stopped at 8:08 p.m., 11 minutes after the nitrogen hypoxia system was turned on. Witnesses reported that Smith appeared to be conscious and that he thrashed violently on the gurney, breathing heavily and salivating for at least 5 minutes before he passed out and was subsequently declared dead. The media was informed by Alabama Corrections Commissioner John Hamm that the alleged observations of Smith convulsing and trembling seemed to be involuntary motions, and that these outcomes were anticipated given the studies done on nitrogen hypoxia. According to Hamm, Smith held his breath for around 4 minutes, which caused Smith's body to react more forcefully. The argument was supported by State Attorney General Steve Marshall, who said that this demonstrated that the nitrogen gas death penalty was a humane and effective method of execution. In a press conference, Alabama Governor K.I.V. declared that justice had been done and expressed her hope that Sennet's family could move on following Smith's execution. Smith's body was then turned over to the Escambia County coroner so that the Department of Forensic Sciences mobile lab could perform an autopsy. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.